Hello, I'm Colin Gautry, and I'd like to share something special with you today. I've been working in the field of power and influence for quite a long time now, and one of the most persistent complaints that I hear from people is about the office politics and the sort of the dirty tricks that may be going on around them, and more specifically, how to deal with them. And so what I've got to share with you today is a recording of a webinar that I did earlier on in the year that talks about the subject of office politics, the emotional, psychological backdrop to it, the specific tactics that are quite often in play, and then more importantly, some constructive ideas of what you might be able to do to handle it and maintain your integrity. So I'd like to suggest you sit back, relax, and make sure to identify some really practical things that you can do, actions that you can take in order to start to deal with the office politics. So what I'd like to do now is to just swap over to the presentation and start to take you through some of the preliminary thoughts, because as I say, office politics and the political ramifications of what is going on in the workplace is very, very sensitive, and people do get quite emotional about it. And what I want to talk about over the next sort of half an hour, 40 minutes or so, are some of the reactions that people have to the politics in the workplace, to the office politics, what sort of attitudes people have as well, because quite often the attitude can get in the way of being able to see what is going on in the workplace and sort of then being able to deal with it. And I'm going to give you some examples. You may have seen some of these before in my book 21 Dirty Tricks at Work, but I want to share some of those with you because it's important when we talk about politics in the workplace to think about what does that actually mean. So in terms of the behaviors that you see being exhibited by your colleagues, what's actually going on. But probably the majority of the time I want to be spending talking about actually what you might be able to do to handle some of these. And for those of you that are already subscribed to the Influence Toolkit, you may have seen a number of these things coming out already, but in particular I'm going to be focusing on the 10 guiding principles of dealing with the office politics. But please do, as I'm going through all of this, remember David is there, he's got a job to do, and I'd like you to be putting your questions to him. We've already had some questions come via the email, so hopefully we can have quite a bit of more bespoke help towards the end of the presentation. So I'm going to move on really now to look at some of the things that are going on in the background and in the psychology, because it's very important that we understand the real nature of office politics and politics in general. And some of those bullet points there I think are really, really important. For instance, it is a basic human trait to try to influence other people. And as part of that, and as the way that starts to work, is that as children, we try to get what we need to be able to survive. As we grow older, we work out how to get the sweets and how to get perhaps an unfair advantage over our peers and the other children in the playground, so that we can be better, look better for ourselves. And that carries on as we learn what works for us. That carries on then through into adult life and into the workplace. And it's really important that we understand that politics just is. It is a fundamental part of being human and human-to-human interactions. The desire to influence the other party. We have ideas, we want to do something, and it's important that we realize, okay, this is normal stuff. But what's not so nice and what's not so normal, and this is why it gets such a bad reputation, is the negative damage that is often caused in the process. And this is often really what I call the distinction between self-serving and other-serving agendas that are going on in the background. And when we see the negative politics, usually there are two things in evidence. Firstly, that somebody is really gunning on their own agenda and wanted to move that forward as quickly as possible and as well as possible. And the other thing, and this is where it starts to get really nasty, is they don't mind what happens. They don't mind the damage that they cause in trampling over people to get to where they want to go. However, the interesting thing is, they've got the self-serving agenda, and they've got the desire to sort of, or the preparedness or the acceptance to actually just do whatever it takes. But the very same tactics that they use will be used by somebody who has got positive intent. So that the actual politics is neutral. It's the intent behind it often that is the difficult thing to deal with. And particularly when it's coming to the damage side and the more negative side, that's where the emotions start to hit. Because if you're being trampled over, if you're being threatened, if your livelihood is on the line because of it, of course you are going to have an emotional reaction. Part of the point about the attitude is that if you always see this as a negative thing, if you always see this as something that you need to be trying to avoid, you may miss opportunities to take positive action to turn it around. And probably one of the things that is there that is probably, there is usually a positive intent behind these, but I'll come to that a little bit later. But it is important that you sort of think about your own attitude and the part that you play. And sometimes this takes a lot of soul searching, but the part you are playing in the experience, because it's never just one-sided. There's two sides. It takes two people to have an argument, for instance, and you need to sort of recognize and be honest with yourself. Okay, am I contributing to this in some way? But going beyond the politics and actually, or the office politics, and thinking in terms of the influence side, what we've got is the reality is that if you cannot handle the political side of organizational life, you are not going to succeed anywhere like as well as you could otherwise have done. And on the slide there, you can see about the Harvard Business Review. This is some research. It's quite old now, but it's still, I think, sort of very, very relevant. And what they are saying is that when looking for the top people in organizations, one of the dimensions that they look at is political capability, the ability to handle the politics. And where a good candidate differs from an elite candidate in this dimension is that the elite candidate understands it, can use it, but uses it in a fair and honest way. And I think that's really the reason why that's there is a call to, you don't have to get dirty with this stuff. You don't have to engage in it in a negative way. You can turn around and actually say, okay, there is a positive and fair way of doing this. Let's understand what's really going on and let's turn it to some constructive advantage. And there is a big benefit to doing that, because if you can get really, really good at that, as the Harvard Business Review research is suggesting, you are likely to be in a much more favorable position, and as the final bullet point says, potentially then even sort of getting more money as a result of that, so being able to sort of really further your career. So what I want to do now is move to some examples, and these are taken from an earlier work which is now nearly 10 years old, but the first book I published was 21 Dirty Tricks at Work. And what I want to do is quite quickly go through these, because you can find all of these online. They're all on the Learn to Influence blog if you just search for them, just to give you some examples of what I mean by dirty tricks or office politics in the workplace. The first one, and some of these will sort of jump out at you as being sort of fairly self-evident what they are, but my hands are tied is the tactic where you go to try and ask somebody for something or to influence something, and they say, sorry, I can't do that, my hands are tied. And what's really going on there, or likely to be going on, is there is something else that they are relying upon as a reason why not to do what you want them to do. It's quite often the case, for instance, in EHR departments, you go to HR to try and say, hey, I want to do this with a particular employee. Sorry, you can't do that. The legislation says this. Basically, they're saying, my hands are tied. We can't say yes to that because of something else, rather than turn around and say, no, I don't think you should be doing that, and here's why you shouldn't be doing it. What people quite often do is turn into or resort back to almost like another power. And in my hands are tied, they're saying, okay, I'm going to rely on the legislation, which may be true, but it may not be true. Because what can often happen is when one of their friends turns up to say, hey, I'd like to do exactly the same thing, then they may say, okay, yeah, we can do that, but we need to do it in a slightly different way. And so they can start to actually maneuver around to suit really their political agenda and what it is they want to do. The next one there is quite an amusing one in many respects, but in terms of the damage that it can cause is really, really big, is the restructure. And this was originated from a colleague of mine who was sort of working with a large organization, and he found out that they'd never fired anybody. When he dug a little bit deeper, what he found was that it wasn't because they didn't need to get rid of people. It was because every time they needed to exit somebody from the organization, they restructured the business. So they had a strategy meeting, looked at the org design, looked at what they needed to do, and therefore to get the person out, that person's department started to disappear or something like that. So restructuring the organization. And where that is a dirty trick is because they're not having an honest conversation with somebody and saying, look, this isn't working out for us. It's probably not working out for you. Let's talk about what we might be able to do about it or what's wrong, rather than have that brave discussion and necessary discussion. They're trying to maneuver around it so that they haven't got to do that. I think partly because we're all human, and when we're interacting with other people, and I'm sort of taking the side of the office politician for a moment, it hurts sometimes to give people bad news. So you can start to empathize that they want to do the right thing, but somewhere along the line, maybe in the playground, they learned there was a different way that they could do it, where they didn't have to get into this rather emotional, difficult sort of situation. So that's the restructure. The tell me more is, in some organizations, endemic. This is a little game or little ruse where you go to present a proposal to perhaps your boss or another key stakeholder, and what they do is they look at it, yeah, okay. But what we need to do before we take it to the board is you need to go away and flesh out the IT spend, or that part of the report. You need to do a little bit more work. What's quite often going on there is another reason behind why they don't want to do it, why they don't want to take it forward, but they're not prepared to tell you for some reason. And that's a little bit odd. I don't understand necessarily why that is the case, but for some reason they have decided the way of dealing with this, instead of getting into a confrontation and maybe potentially an argument, or dare I say, upsetting you, they'd sooner give a little distraction. The problem is that creates an awful lot of damage in the relationship, but also potentially a lot of cost, because if you do then go away, investigate further on the IT spend, build a business case, rope in other people as well to actually come and help sort of flesh out some of the detail, that's starting to consume time and quite possibly money. Another one there, which is another common, very, very common one, is email to the gods. And this probably doesn't need much explaining, other than this is the email that drops into your inbox with hundreds of people copied in. So, on the CC line, an endless list. And usually these come in a little bit of a critical way. So they're perhaps criticizing you in some way, shape or form based on something you've done, or something that the other person is pretending that you have done or said. And it's a tactic really to try to put you into a more difficult position in the gaze of the assembled CC list. And that, having talked to people on workshops, that seems to be probably one of the most difficult in terms of emotional impact, but also really, really difficult in knowing what to do about it and how to respond. And that whole thing about, do you reply to all, or what do you say, or do you leave it at night, is a really, really serious problem for somebody. But there are a lot of things, and I'll come to those a little bit later, that you can do about that will stop it dead in its tracks. But the whole thing about email, copying, CCing lots and lots of people in, is a deliberate tactic to put you on the back foot and actually discomfit you, so that you're sort of not perhaps sort of responding in the way that you would normally do. Development opportunity is another one there that is really there for amusement, and also from a linguistic point of view. What a development opportunity is when somebody says to you, hey, this will be really good for your career if you go and do that rubbish job over there. And it's really, they want to try and get you to do something that they need doing, but they dress it up as something that might be career enhancing, or be good opportunity for learning, or whatever it is behind it, rather than saying, look, this is a pile of rubbish. it needs to be done. Can you do me a favor and just do it? Or something like that, something more authentic is just not happening. And the reason why I say linguistic is a bit like, is it a challenge or is it a problem? And there's this whole thing that is, I mean, maybe a little bit, sort of a little while ago, 10, 15 years ago, well, nobody had problems, they all had challenges. What's happened now is if you say, oh, it's just a challenge, everybody realizes it's a problem. And so the linguistic definition, or the definition of challenge, is starting to change into problem. Development opportunity is similar. It's turning into, rubbish assignment on the way rather than development opportunity. And the final one, that before I start to turn to the more positive things that we can do about these things, is the photocopier game. And this is really by way of example of just how bad things can get in terms of the nasty side of politics. And again, this was an example that a colleague of mine came up with in a company where the HR director went to the photocopier early one morning to copy a few bits of paper. And when she opened the photocopier, there was something already there. She looked at it and realized it was an org chart. In fact, it was an org chart of HR, and it didn't have her on it. She was obviously a little bit shocked. This was all news to her. Where had this come from? So she went storming into the chief exec's office, wanted to know and demanded to know, look, what the hell's going on here? How dare you do this? Nobody's consulted me, and really lost it from an emotional level. And the CEO just sort of calmly sort of waited for her to finish, and then really just turned around and said, but that's exactly why, because here is another example of where you can't control yourself or whatever. And so he used it. He basically baited her into an emotional outburst that could give further evidence as to why she should be going. And that's just one example, and there are other things. But this is where it gets at the really dirty end, the nasty end, where people are deliberately doing things to basically get rid of people. And that's something that is really, well, not very nice to be on the receiving end, nor to actually see it going on. So that's just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. And one of the common themes through here, well, there's two really important themes. Number one is, usually there's a lie at back of one of these, because of course your hands can be tied for legitimate legal reasons, but usually when it's being used as a dirty trick, there could be another answer if they chose to. So they're lying in terms of how severe the legislation is, or whatever it is that they're resting back against. So they're lying. So the restructure is a lie. It's not that we want to get rid of you, but there's no place in the organisation for you. Tell me more is, I don't want to take it to the board, but I don't want to tell you that because that will discourage you. So I'm going to lie and say, hey, can you do some more work on it? And so a lie, the lie in all of these tricks is one of the things. The other thing is that it's trying to play to their agenda, and they're trying to use it to further their own ends at the expense of other people. And I think that's another part which you need to be just very cognizant of. These dirty tricks are being played for a reason, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. So if I now just move on, because I now want to start talking about, so if that's the political games that are going on, that's what's happening, what can you do about it if you are in the firing line? And I'm going to go reasonably slowly over these because I want to help you to understand them and their impact as much as possible, but also to encourage you to sort of read beyond these as well, because some of these take a while to, I suppose, get into and to really sort of embrace. And number one there is to really recognize that these games are going on. There's two parties also to then confront them, because what I find a lot of is that people don't know what's actually happening. That's one of the reasons why we wrote the 21 Dirty Tricks at Work, to actually give people almost like a catalogue so that they could start to realize what exactly was going on. So we hear a lot of, it's very political around it here, people are always playing games. But what specifically are they doing? And I think it's really important that if you're in the face of a political game, somebody sort of really messing about with you, that you take a time out and try to objectively observe, but what is actually going on? What is the tactic that is in use here? And it doesn't have to conform to one of our nice, neat 21 dirty tricks, but what is really going on? Sometimes that takes a little while to figure out, and sometimes you need to talk to a few other people around it as well. But it's important to A, recognize it, but then confront it. And that's a difficult one, particularly if you're in an emotional state, if you're reacting to it. So you do need to sort of take a deep breath, or maybe take a time out and actually say, okay, so how can I do this? But the point is, if you don't confront it in some way, it's going to carry on, because the game player is using a strategy. Remember the playground analogy, is using a strategy to get what they want, and it's working. And it's not until you start to confront the issue and start to deal with it that they start to realize, no, it's not. It's no longer working, or it's not working as well, which is then where the tables can start to turn. So you've got to find a way that you feel comfortable with, based on your sense of empowerment, that you can begin to tackle the behavior that you want to stop. So recognize and then start to learn how to, or think about how to confront it. This whole thing about number 2 there is keeping your emotions under control. Absolutely. You really do need to be quite objective, firstly in your analysis, but then in the way you deal with it. It's a bit like with the email to the gods, responding, and we all know, well, I like to think we all know this now, when you get one of those land in your inbox, and we all get them, when one lands in your inbox, don't reply to it straight away. I mean, it used to be, write it but don't send it, but there were too many accidents with that, with people hitting send by mistake. But so the initial response is usually not the best response. So when something happens, and this is sort of one of the tactics, or the responses, that you do nothing immediately. So hold back, think about it, analyze it, and really start to recognize, and this is the next part of it, is it something you should be worried about? And this is a difficult one, because immediately the emotional reaction is, yes, this is a problem, this is really hurting. What usually happens is, in the cold light of day, when you start to analyze it, and if you are doing other good things in terms of influencing your stakeholders, etc., it will help you. But often these games are being played by powerless people who have little other way of influencing you. They can't actually use legitimate ways to influence you, so they're starting to play games to try and get their way. So, and that's not the case all the time, but just be aware it happens far more than you might think. And usually when people do find a way, or started to confront these, the person who is playing the game starts to crumble. They start to sort of disappear, and it's not working anywhere like as well as they thought it was. So actually you didn't need to worry about it as much as you were. But you've got to get through the emotion before you can start to analyze that, before you can start to see it. So really that's why I'm referring to reach for the facts and see if you can find out what's really going on there. Number 3, excuse me, is really about considering the bigger picture. Because again, I like to think of the office politics as being quite petty generally. It's small little maneuvers by small little people. They may appear really, really big, which is why I'm saying, okay, manage the fear and look at the reality. But there is a big world out there, and all of these are being played in a bigger stage. And it's important that you actually recognize it within the context of what's actually going on. Quite often these are petty little, trifling little things that shouldn't get the attention that you are giving them. And I'll come to that a little bit later in a minute as well, because it's about actually getting it into context. Not always the case, and with some political maneuvers that are going on, it's really on the big stage that these things are happening, but that's more where it becomes like a power battle between two very powerful people. In the office politics side of things, this is usually about somebody achieving a small victory rather than winning a big war. So make sure and consider the bigger picture. And number 4 is, and I think this is really, really important, when you're confronting a game, when you're confronting somebody who's playing a trick on you or a dirty trick, it's very easy to get into the mode, you shouldn't be doing that. You know, that's not the way we should be behaving in this professional workspace, etc. Unfortunately, what that is doing is that is potentially backing them into a corner where you are accusing them of doing something that they shouldn't be doing, which could give rise to an emotional reaction from them, which could all culminate in them fighting back even harder and hurting you even more. So what we're suggesting here with number 4 is to think clearly, think objectively about what is going on, and start to look at, well, what is the constructive thing that we should be doing as a couple, as two people in this situation? What suggestions can I potentially put forward that will give that person the opportunity to come forward and interact with me in a more authentic way, in a higher trust, higher sort of level of honesty, so that you can get things moving? And what is, and we have done quite a bit of research on this, what quite often happens is they will take that opportunity. If you word it in a very good way, if you think about how you're going to deliver this, rather than be accused, they will more likely take your offer if it is something that they feel that is something that they could do and is still helping them to achieve what it is they want to get out of the situation. So you know, looking for creatively for the ways forward and the ways out is a really key part of dealing with the office politics. Number 5 is about putting out the fires and building bridges. And this is right, I suppose, really where it comes down to bringing in the context, bringing in the big picture, and looking at what needs to be dealt with, what are the fires that you need to be attending to, and what can you leave to just burn out, but also looking to build the relationship. Because if you think back to one of the themes to the dirty tricks, which was about the lie, they're lying for a reason. They're lying for a reason that is, if they told the truth, you wouldn't want to do what they're doing, what they're trying to get you to do, or there's some other reason why they felt it was necessary to lie to you. It could mean that they don't trust you, that they feel they need to play a game to get you to do what they need you to do, because if they were very straightforward with you, you'd probably say no. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize, because this is about, okay, how can we build bridges in this relationship? How can, and look for the creative ways to actually start to open up the relationship so that you can have a more honest and frank conversation and really have the straight dealing that is going on. People resort to politics when they need to, or maybe by habit. And if you've got a good level of trust within the relationship, they probably will, or they will be less likely to feel that they need to resort to the games and dirty tricks. So that's number 5. Number 6, walk in their shoes. And this is a hard one, particularly if you're on the sharp end of some really nasty politics. But again, this is an entreaty to really find out what's going on in their world. Quite often there's an awful lot happening that you're not aware of, or that your emotional reaction is filtering out so that you can't see it, so that you can't really sort of appreciate where they're coming from. What this is not saying is agree with their position. What this is saying is try to really understand where they're coming from, what they're trying to achieve, what life is like for them. This starts to open up, and it may seem a bit incredible, but this starts to open up the door to empathy and understanding and communicating with a more empathetic approach. And that gives you a lot more alternatives and a lot more ways of, a lot more ways to actually open out and to build more bridges. So it's really important, I think, to walk in their shoes, and that's when you really start to understand what could be going on. Sometimes that is difficult because it's very hard with some of these characters to get to know them, but start to imagine, start to live in their world a little bit, and imagine if you were in their shoes, what would you be thinking, what would you be doing, what pressures would you be under? And then maybe even talk to friends as well. And I'm just going to add this extra in. When you're talking to the friends, though, just make sure that you're not just getting their emotional support when you're in a difficult moment. What you need to try and do to get real value out of that, conversation with a friend is to get them to be honest with you as a friend, what's really going on from their perspective and from what they're doing. Most friends will automatically want to offer, a lot of sympathy, a lot of empathetic support. Oh yeah, they're terrible people, aren't they, etc. That's not going to help you to handle the politics. That's going to help you to handle your emotions. That's going to help you to actually feel better about yourself in that situation. It isn't going to necessarily help you to deal with the office politician. So try to walk in their shoes. Number 7, and I sort of touched on this earlier on, but I just want to take a little bit more, or put a bit more focus on this, is take time out. One of the things that is quite obvious when people are ill prepared to deal with the politics, the best option is not to do anything straight away. Get some time, go away and think, consult with a few trusted friends and allies, and take some time to let the emotions settle. One of the things that an office politician will be trying to do wherever possible is to get you to react instantly, because that is then to their advantage. So if you can find a way to take it offline, to give yourself some space, and to really think it through and plan a response, which may not be a direct one, it may be through somebody else that you may know may be able to help you with this. Don't necessarily react straight away. Is my earnest intent there on number 7. And we're nearly there, but number 8, look for the positive intent. This is usually a difficult one to sort of take on board, but this is coming from occupational psychology, organizational psychology, really, that, you know, everybody as a human being is out there in the world sort of trying to do the best for themselves and for their loved ones. What goes wrong, and I alluded to this earlier on, is that at some point they've made a connection between doing harm to others and gaining benefit for themselves because it seemed to work. And then they repeated it and they carried on doing it. And number 8, about looking for the positive intent, is really to look for the human in the other side, in the office politician, the person that is adversely affecting you, and actually say, well, actually, yeah, I can sort of understand. I don't agree with them. I don't agree with the way they're doing it, but I can sort of understand where they're coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. And the reason why that is useful is it's about helping you to actually look at them and deal with them in a more neutral way, in a less emotional way. It's not about them and you and them. It's then about appreciating them as an individual, not necessarily agreeing with what they're doing, but then sort of thinking, okay, so what can I now do? And so it puts you into a potentially a much better frame of mind to be able to go and deal with them. And number 9 always makes me smile when I see this one, because so often we are very, very good at guessing what other people are after. I remember, I'll just give you a quick example because it's really, really quite, well, it was quite fun at the time. Was a coffee break in a workshop. The guy pulled me to one side and said, "Can I just talk to you for a moment, Colin? I'm about to be fired." I said, "Okay, why do you think that?" And he went through all of the rational argument, what his boss was doing, his boss's boss. He basically put together a complete case history of what was going wrong and why he was about to be fired. It was quite, what was amusing about it was this guy was a lawyer as well. But the one thing that he hadn't done is asked his boss what was really going on. And for some reason, he'd just not done that. He convinced himself that he was doing it. And I later found out he completely got it wrong. He completely misread the facts. There were some things that he'd overlooked or not known about. And when he did sort of approach his boss and say, "Look, boss, hey, what's really going on here? Because it seems like," "Oh, no, that's not what's going on at all." You know, so it's really just a little example of how we can so easily fantasize way beyond reality of what other people are trying to do, when the shortcut is, if you can develop a relationship, if you can get a degree of trust there, is to actually just go and ask them, "So what is it you're trying to achieve out of this situation, or what is it you're after? What do you want to have as an outcome?" And actually just start to not only ask them, but then watch the response. And I say watch deliberately because sometimes they might lie and they might say, okay, they want something that they don't necessarily level with you. If you haven't got a high level of trust or a good relationship with you, that's more likely. But watch the body language, because if they're lying, it will probably tell at some point that that's not quite there, and maybe you can come back with another question to actually provide a little bit more of an example or more evidence as to what's really going on. So dig a little bit deeper, build the relationship as you're going until you get to the bottom of what it is they really want. And sometimes that you'll be pleasantly surprised that you can very easily do it without actually having the politics going on. And number 10, just finally, before we then start to, and I hope David's sort of coming up with some, getting some questions, collecting some questions for me in a moment, but don't fight every battle. You don't have to deal with all of this. Remember the context, remember to put it into perspective and actually think, okay, is this worth fighting or not? And I'm going to go through a list of more strategic things that you can do in a moment before we get to the questions. But it's not. Sometimes you need to release it. Sometimes you need to just let it wash over you. When you attend to it, it becomes more of a problem. When you worry about it, it becomes an even bigger problem. Sometimes it's more important to just, okay, that's just a trifling little thing. I'm not going to worry about that because I've got bigger things to do elsewhere. And so that's sort of, point number 10 is you don't have to sweat the small stuff. The problem is that a lot of the time it looks far bigger than it actually is in terms of the politics. So just before asking David to come in, I just want to sort of share with you a couple of other things, and again they'll be on the slides that I send out at the end, and these are more strategic things that you can be doing to start to minimize some of the problems that you've got. And number one is really focus more on what it is you are trying to do. Office politicians are out for what they can get. If you're responding to them, you're likely to be forgetting what it is you're there in the organization to do. And that's to your advantage to actually focus on what you're being paid to do rather than being distracted by the others who would have you do something else. The other thing is keep your eyes open. You don't, the last time to actually try to work out what the politics are is when it's hurting. If you can actually see the politics, see the shape of it, see the landscape and know how the land lies and use that as an ongoing inquiry, you're far more likely to be able to deal very, very quickly and easily with somebody who is playing dirty tricks or games with you. But that is an ongoing attempt to sort of keep that radar on, keep looking at what's happening and see what might be coming towards you so you can potentially start to preempt it. The other thing is, it's not necessarily just about you and them. There are a lot of other people involved. And if you take a more strategic approach to your work, looking at the bigger picture and what you're there to do, there are a lot of other people involved as well. Make sure to build as many good relationships as you can with these other stakeholders, because they may be the ones who you need to sort of pull on to actually, or to draw on to actually stop the office politician in their tracks. The other thing is, you shouldn't be in isolation, particularly in large organizations. Wherever possible, build your network as wide as possible. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Firstly, I mean, you're going to get a lot more help in terms of doing your job, but also you're potentially building an intelligence network and also a support network for when the politicians do try to come and put you out of their way or to back you into a corner. You've potentially got a lot more. One of the worst things, and maybe one of the things that certainly an office politician, but definitely a bully will rely on or want to orchestrate, is you being on your own and isolated, unsupported, because then you're easy prey and they can more likely get. So the more connections you've got, the stronger relationships you've got with other people around the organization, the far better you are going to be prepared for this. And I'm going to go quickly over these because I want to get to the questions. But the other thing is sort of really looking at, what makes you influential in the organization? What contribution are you making? Because power and the way power works is about supply and demand. And if your stakeholders, your boss, the people that are using your services are acutely aware of the value that you bring, they will be far more likely to help you in a difficult moment. They will be far more likely to look after you and protect you because you've got something that they really value. And if you can focus on building that value, and usually this is building the self-concept of what that value represents, you're going to be in a much, much stronger position to be able to, well, not be affected by the politicians, not be affected by the office politics, and for it to be in the trivial factor in your daily life, and almost to the extent where you might, and it may seem a bit incredible at the moment, but might be able to laugh at other people's antics as they try to get what they want. If you've got it sorted out in a strategic way, you're not going to have to worry about them. And so, if people have got the power, if people have got that value contribution, they don't need to play the politics, and they don't need to put up with the politics anywhere like as much as everybody else. So, but these take a while. These take a while to build. But if you start now by actually looking at where you are, where you want to be, you can start building this for the future so that you get less affected by the office politician. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm hoping you've been giving David some questions while I've been talking. So I'm going to hand over to David and say, what do you want to know?
Hi, everyone. I have two interesting questions that actually came in before today. First was quite delightful and touches on, I think, some of the earlier games you mentioned, Colin, which is that indeed some people just like the drama, which in a sense can be bad for many reasons, question mark with that. But how can we still have fun at work but cut out the drama?
I think it's the whole thing about the drama. Some people really do relish the game playing. And I remember a director, 15 or more years ago, in a company that I was working with, when I sat down and started talking to him about the dynamics that were going on in the workplace and around, he said, "Isn't it fun?" What do you mean? What do you mean, Jeff? What's fun about it? He said, but just actually looking at what people are doing, looking at the strategies that they're unfolding, looking at where they're trying, I find it endlessly fascinating, far better than chess, far better than, and he was really enjoying it. And I'm not sure whether he was positive or negative in terms of the way he was playing the politics, but I think he'd managed to get himself into a position where he's probably ticked off all of those strategic things and actually is feeling quite comfortable that he can handle himself in the face of all the politics, which is why I put those there, to actually move people towards that. But it's also, he could then relax, and it wasn't a problem, and he could then start to enjoy it a little bit. But it is quite serious, and that's, at the senior level, when you direct and things like that, it's easy to say that. But at a lower level, I think the more you can empower yourself, the less troubled you will be by it, and the more you can potentially enjoy it for what it is, and also potentially reduce its impact for other people as well. And I think it's really important that, to enjoy it, you've got to firstly understand it, understand what it's doing. Secondly, you've got to be feeling strong and able to handle yourself in the face of these politics so that you don't need to worry about it. And I think thirdly, you've got to be feeling personally quite secure that if the worst happened, well, you've just got another job to go to because you're in demand, or something like that. You've got to feel that you're not going to be adversely affected, because it gets really, really trying, really, really worrying when you might lose your job. And that's totally understandable. If you've already got the alternatives stacked up, then you're going to be in a much more position to be able to relax and enjoy it. And actually, it reminds me of another organisation that I worked with a long time ago, where it was probably the best organisation I've seen in terms of the level of positive politics. The level of negative politics, they'd managed it in such a way, the senior team, that it didn't really exist. But it wasn't a comfortable place to be. It was an extremely energetic organisation where they were fighting to get the job done, to beat the market, to do this, do that, do the other. But it was done in more of a spirit of collegiate spirit, where the strongest will survive, and come on, I can get there first. And it was really quite a competitive environment, but it wasn't a damaging environment. Of course, if you didn't have the skills to be able to do it, then you were going to get left behind. But those people in that organisation were using the positive politics very, very hard, very, very ruthless, and they were getting a stunning level of performance. And they were all having a good time. So it's just a few thoughts.
That's nice. Yes, it's about the culture we develop, I think, in organisations, and about being open and honest and building that. But of course, it comes from the top, from the leadership to some extent, I guess. I've got two interesting questions along a similar theme, actually. And I'm not mentioning any of your names here on purpose for this. A rather distressing real situation of a manipulative boss overtly trying to oust an individual. In fact, supporting bullying and harassment in the organization, and not supporting this individual in informal complaints. And I think 5 years, she describes, of backstabbing and bullying takes its toll, and being relieved to be out. And I guess there's maybe you might have a comment to make on that, but a more specific question around on that, which has just come in, is that if you know you're being discussed behind your back, or even just in private, including, your boss, and you know what is being discussed is important to your career, how would you actually recommend trying to reveal the issues in an open conversation? And I guess whatever you say on that is going to inform the first question.
Okay, well, there's obviously quite a lot in that, and the first is to recognise and acknowledge that these things do happen and they hurt, and there's a lot of damage being created by people who are prepared to do whatever it takes to serve their own ends, and that needs to be recognised. I think another point that is really important, and this is a tough one, is that at some stage you might need to make the decision that you're not going to win, that you're not going to actually be able to overcome this, because you can't always do that. Sometimes the powers are so extreme that you're just never going to win. And whilst it is laudable to try to actually turn it around, try to actually make things right, sometimes you've got to recognize that there is a cost to doing that, and an early exit might be a good route to pursue. And yes, of course, you've got to find another job. But sometimes, continuing to battle away is soul destroying, it's stressful, it can have health consequences, rather than realizing, okay, it's not going to happen here in this organization with these people, I'm off. All right. And I think making an early exit decision, not just go and resign, but do it in your terms and your timing, I think is something that you've got to recognize as an option in those sort of situations. But the other thing about the second part of that question was about how do you confront when you know those sort of conversations are going on, is that the reason why they're not talking to you is because there is something wrong in the relationship. It might be because they don't like you. It might be because they feel you are a threat to them. Something is not right in the relationship. If the relationship was really, really good, the open conversation wouldn't be a problem. There's got to be a reason why they're not being open. So the first point I would say is start to think and try to puzzle out, be curious, puzzle out, why aren't they being open about this? If you can start to shed some light on that, you might then start to realize, okay, well, there's something I'm doing wrong here. I'm not sort of getting on well with this group. I'm a different sort of person. Again, you may then decide, okay, exit, stage left. But that's then a choice, a deliberate choice that you can make in your own time. But it's also, I think, really important that you start to actually look realistically at what you're doing, the way you've been interacting with them in the past. What may be the cause of the reason why they're doing it? And it could be nothing to do with you whatsoever. It could just be that you're competing with one of their best friends, or their lovers or something. Lovers, yeah, quite often in workplaces that is the case. So it could be that there is something else that you're not aware of that is creating this. And again, it might mean, okay, there's nothing I'm going to be able to do with that. This is my sense of integrity. Okay, I'm going to realize, let's just manage the situation as well as I can, but look for other opportunities in a different pace. Or it may give you an opportunity to actually take some different decisions and work in a slightly different way with those people over a period of time, so that you can grow the level of trust in the relationship. Usually it's down to trust or lack of it that these things are going on for whatever reason. So you can work out what the reason is, then start to work hard on, I think, on really building the trust, so that that conversation starts to happen. Without trust, it's unlikely to happen, and even if it does, you probably can't rely on what they're saying.
Yeah, time to wind up. So if there is a comment or a question you'd like to make, please drop it in. I'll pass it to Colin. Meanwhile, Colin, the thoughts I were having in terms of those people that we see in organisations that just make this look easy, that just make the influencing and the politics, that ride above all of this. What qualities and skills do you see in successful, positive, authentic politicians in organisations? What should we be looking to develop in ourselves?
So looking to develop in terms of the longer term behavioural. I think there's a number of things. I think number one is get into the position where you know what's really going on. And that takes time, particularly when you're new in an organisation. But unless you really know what's going on, you're guessing. If you're guessing, you're going to make the wrong move. So you've got to dramatically reduce the level of uncertainty. It's quite an interesting, with one client that I was working with recently, they said that their senior executive team, or their succession pool, they wanted to help them to become politically courageous. And when I thought this one through, I thought, hang on, there's something not quite right here. And it comes down to certainly the consideration that I had and where I got to is that you only need to be courageous if you don't know what you're doing and what's happening. If you had total certainty that if you did this, that would happen, you don't need to be brave. You only need to be courageous when you're uncertain. And so you can't know everything, but the more you can learn about what is going on, the people, the better. I think the next thing that is really important is the level and quality of the relationships that you build. Because if you can build really high levels of trust from the outset, from the beginning of your relationships, even when you're going into an organization, objective number one is start to build the trust with everybody that you meet. Everybody, try to get that level of trust there. That doesn't mean trust stupidly the other people, but just start, and there are various processes in the way trust is built, to learn how to build trust, I think, quite quickly. And then I think that probably the third thing, and then I'm conscious of the time and we're really running out of time, is to think about how to empower yourself so that the consequences of negative politicking are less for you than for others. So really empowering yourself by building your external profile, for instance, by building your network outside of the organization, by building more support around you, because we all need support around us, and generally sort of putting yourself into the position where you have a higher level of self-confidence, so that when you do meet these things, they are less troublesome to you. And I think the people that are really, really sort of excelling and moving into the higher league with these things are able to actually understand what's really going on, get to the bottom of all the major agendas that are running. They really empower themselves, and they sort of, you know, are not too worried about it. And so yes, it happens, it's a feature of organizational life, but hey, there are bigger things that we're trying to do here. So that's what I would say in answer to that, David. But I'm conscious now that we've really run out of time. I hope you've enjoyed what we've been talking about today, and it's been great to get some of those questions. As I said, this is the first Influence Toolkit webinar that we've done, so hopefully it's worked for you and you've got some ideas. As you probably already know, there's a huge amount of information on the blog, articles and ideas. So just go to the blog, learntoinfluence.com. There's a search bar down there. So for instance, if you wanted to find articles that I've written on trust, just pop trust in there and it will come up with a lot of articles that will help you. Because all of this is about trying to find, well, everything that I'm trying to do is find practical ways to help people to become more influential. And it is an ongoing task. We're all learning all of the time. So I would encourage you to sort of participate in the blog, join the blog, read around the subject, and this is a very serious point. If you've got a question, just ask. So, but please do email any questions, and thank you for participating.